think we're about to get started. This is one last session before lunch. So while this conference is a FIDO-sponsored conference, it is called Authenticate, and that means we want to talk about all types of authentication. The call center is an area that's getting a lot more attention these days, in part because if we lock everything down in the web and browser and mobile app channel with things like passkeys, well, then the bad guys are going to go through another channel, and the call center gets really tricky. So Lance is going to join us to tell us what we need to know. Thanks. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So just a little bit of background before I start. I'm responsible at TransUnion for our authentication solution products, and that spans both the digital channel, step-up authentication, but also our solution for call center authentication. And you might wonder, why is that important? Well, it's important because account takeover fraud is one of the fastest growing areas for fraud in general, right? There's lots of fraud, synthetic identities, and all these types of things. But certainly, even before the COVID era, the amount of account takeover fraud was growing. Average fraud losses from account takeover fraud was increasing. And the majority, based on studies that have been done, this one I'm citing here is from IT, of actual account takeover fraud starts in the call center. Part of the reason for that is what Jeremy said. We've hardened up the digital channels really well. We're all here, most of us here, further hardening the digital channels. And fraudsters aren't just waiting to go into the call center, which we'll see is a much softer target. And so I want to talk to you about both why it's a softer target and some of the things and technologies that are very comparable to FIDO passkeys that can be deployed in the unique environment of the telephone network and call centers. So what are the reasons that call centers are a soft target? I would argue that it's because most of the tools that are used today to protect accounts through authentication are pretty weak. And I'll talk about two of those. First of all, there's a long-term increased or excessive amount of reliability or reliance on knowledge-based authentication. And then secondarily, biometrics have been used quite a bit in the call centers, and there's some real concerns growing about the viability of those techniques, which leaves the call center as a soft product. So just quickly going through some of the issues around knowledge-based authentication. That whole concept, of course, is that there's a question, and in theory, the legitimate owner of an account is the only one that can answer that question. The challenge, of course, is that may not be the case. What we've seen through a fraud study that TransUnion produces each year is that there's just a dramatic increase in the amount of PII, personal information, that is leaking out. And this study particularly, an 81% increase just between 2019 and 2022. One of the divisions of TransUnion is called Sontig, and for many years has produced a report. They basically track data breaches. And I've presented this slide probably for 4 years. And every year I think, okay, this year finally these numbers are going to go down. They never go down. Every year there are more data breaches, and every year more customer accounts get exposed. And that's important because what fraudsters are trying to do is build a profile of their victim that they're going to be attacking. And they may attack that victim in multiple different organizations. And we just keep throwing out the keys to accounts because we throw out the answers to all these questions and give them to the fraudsters. And as that wasn't bad enough, as consumers, we further help fraudsters. Because a lot of these questions that are going to get answered in the call center, and you're probably all familiar with this: what was your birthday? What's your favorite pet? Where do you like to go on vacation? Guess what? All that information sits in your Facebook account or TikTok or all these different accounts. And so we really make it easy for fraudsters to beat these systems. And yet, ironically, this is the most common technique used to try to defend our accounts. We did a couple of different webinars with the American Banking Association. In each of these webinars, I asked, one of the poll questions, I love poll questions in webinars, is what are the techniques that you're using to do authentication in your call center? List them all out. And very consistently, 2/3, both surveys, each one over 100 respondents, the only thing they use to authenticate in the call center is knowledge-based authentication. So despite all of the weaknesses, that is still the standard, even in the banking industry, that is protecting the most important assets in accounts that most people have. And beyond that, of course, everybody, all of us, hate having to go through that interrogation process. I love this one quote that answering knowledge-based authentication questions is more annoying than shoveling snow or having rain on your vacation. I'm not sure that's completely accurate, but that's what the respondent said. The bottom line is it is a terrible customer experience on top of being a largely ineffective solution that really is not predictive of the identity of a caller anymore. So as a consequence of that, not too long ago, maybe about 4 years ago, we really started to see an uptake in the use of biometric-based authentication. And that spans different channels, but in the call center, we really saw voice biometrics starting to be adopted. And the concept here, of course, is that we can take a biometric, whether that's a facial scan or fingerprint or your voice, and create a digital representation of that. We can match that to a reference biometric and provide a good, solid, trusted authentication experience based on that. And I think for many years that was true. But as we've heard in some of the sessions this week, there's some real concerns about biometrics now, and particularly as artificial intelligence and deepfake technology are more used. So the real question now is, can we use these types of technologies to beat these systems? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is yes. I was in a customer conference last week, and there was a discussion about facial biometrics, and that the system that was in place to detect and authenticate based on facial recognition, it actually failed. It even had liveness tests. And what was interesting was that humans could still see that that was really not a true live video being produced, but it beat the authentication service. Now that's a digital channel thing, but in the call center, we're seeing more and more concerning reports in the media and examples of how these systems can be actually beaten. And I think on Monday there was that really good keynote address that talked about the CNN reporters, administrator who had been fooled as part of a scam. And that was based on, I think it was 2 minutes of audio was used to create that false voice. And that's just one example. We've seen since about April of this year more and more media reports of reporters who have been able to go out using their own voice, but basically beat true voice biometric systems. Some of it happened in the UK, some of it's happened here. Most concerning to me was a kind of a TED Talk that was done by two guys from the Center for Human Technology. It's basically an artificial intelligence sort of think tank thinking about how AI can be beneficial to humans and also some of the risks about it. Their claim was that you only need 3 seconds of audio in order to effectively mimic a voice, and that many of us are already offering that out. The example being our customized voicemail messages that we have when you call us and we're not on our phone. So we're just offering up many times more than the 3 seconds that a fraudster may need in order to effectively mimic your voice and beat an AI system, or beat a voice biometric authentication system. Their claim is that by the end of this year, biometrics in the call center will be dead. So I don't know that that's completely true, can't tell the timeline, but I think what is going on is almost a race, if you will, between the AI, and I deal with a lot of these vendors, the AI that the vendors are using to try to do authentication, and then over here you got the AI being used by the fraudsters, and they're both sort of going back and forth trying to figure out how to use these tools, and as one takes one step, the other has to take another step. So it really is a race going on. I think the important point is we really don't know who's winning the race. And just the fact that there's a race going on with uncertainty means that there are a lot of doubts about how we can use this type of a tool to defend accounts in the call center. So I think it's time that we rethink the authentication process a bit. And that's what I kind of want to present, a different way of thinking about authentication that I think isn't just about the call center, but a lot of what we're here today, or here this week, to focus on with passkeys as well. So if you think about multi-factor authentication, going back to kind of the standard model, there's knowledge, something you know, there's inherent, something the user is, that's where biometrics fits, and then finally there's ownership or device-based authentication. And historically, I think we have all seen kind of these Venn diagrams of, let's take these three and multi-factor. I get two factors, I get two overlaps. If I can get in the middle and I get three, I've got really strong three-factor authentication. The problem with this is that it presents each of these factors as sort of equally viable. And in reality, I think what we're seeing is it's time to rethink that a little bit. And instead of this Venn diagram, I would propose we need to really look at devices, the sort of traditional device-based authentication that's been around for thousands of years. The key to your house gives you access to the house. And use that as the foundation for authentication. If you think about how passkeys are commonly being used, right, that's a device-based approach. And then on top of that, we may layer a facial scan or a fingerprint. And it really does follow this model, but the key is that at that foundation, we're using something that's highly trusted. And what I want to talk to you about the rest of the presentation is just how we can apply this same kind of concept of device-based authentication, but in a phone call, which is very different technically from the internet where we can apply passkeys. And again, it's important because the fraud originating in the call center is of a high level of concern. So I'll reference another study that we did this year, or another component of that authentication survey that TransUnion produces each year. And this is, again, it's just stating whether you're in a variety of different industries or particularly financial services focused, there is a tremendous amount of concern about fraud in the call center. And, you know, again, back to Jeremy's earlier point, as we continue to harden up the digital channels, this is only going to get worse. And I think we're seeing in this survey response some recognition that there is a growing gap between how we're hardening the digital channels and how we're not making as much progress in the call center channels. So how can that work? And this is the technology that I kind of want to make sure everybody is aware of. It is possible in the phone network to basically do a device-based authentication approach. So how does that work? Phone call comes into a call center. When that call arrives, it has a claimed phone number that the call originated from. It may be accurate or it may not be accurate, but it is the number that is supposed to be calling. At that point in time, when that call is connected, but it's not yet been answered, it's a two-step process, it is possible from within the phone network to make a special type of probe out to that claimed calling number. And if that number is on a call, that's great. And further, that type of probe can determine that that phone is actually on a call with the call center's number. And in that sense, establish that it's a really, truly legitimate phone call, that it's coming from a unique, physical, traceable device, that it hasn't been spoofed or virtualized or manipulated in any way. And it ends up producing a very strong authentication token, very analogous to I'm on my device, I've used my passkey, and I've successfully authenticated into a web account. So this is really the kind of most strong way, or the strongest way, that call centers can really begin to defend themselves. And the nice thing about this is it all takes place before the call is answered. It is applicable to all calls into the call center. There is no enrollment process, as there would be, for example, with passkeys. It's instantly available to everybody. It's invisible to callers, and it provides this very strong method of authentication. Now, one of the other aspects of using this kind of technology is not just how it can find the good callers, but can it also help find the bad guys? And one of the things we see in this study that we did is that within the call center environment, there's a very strong preference. 3 out of 4 people involved in call centers want technologies to support both authentication but also risk detection, finding the really risky callers. So one of the nice things about inspecting that phone and probing phones within the phone network is you get a lot of information about how calls are being made. And there are different factors that are used by criminals as they seek to take over accounts. But one of the most important things to a criminal is, well, obviously they want to steal something, but they don't want to get caught. And because they don't want to get caught, they always are trying to remain anonymous and untraceable. So think about a bank robber. Bank robber goes into the bank, they wear a mask, they have changed the license plates on the getaway car and they get away. They wear the mask to be anonymous, and they've changed those license plates so they're untraceable. Turns out when criminals are using the phone system to take over accounts in a call center, they do the same type of thing. They use techniques like spoofing, where they will fake the number they're calling from. They will use a virtual calling service, and you can see these are both growing very rapidly as fraudster techniques. Now, a virtual calling service is, you might be familiar with Google Voice, Skype. These have pretty rigorous registration requirements. Unfortunately, there are hundreds of little apps that are very similar that allow you, with minimal registration verification, to go online, and you can be laying on a beach in Bali, and you can pick an area code for this area of California, and you can get a prefix for this part of California, and then you can get that phone number. You can start making calls to banks in this area and starting to take over accounts, and guess what? You're never going to be traceable. And when you think about it, 1/3 of all calls into most organizations come from phone numbers that aren't on file. So there's nothing suspicious about this at all. So these are just two techniques that are used to by fraudsters to try to take over accounts. And what we can do, though, when we are looking at how these phone calls are made, the history of the use of that particular phone number, the attributes of the device associated with the phone number, is we can start to recognize that criminals really do make phone calls in different ways than legitimate customers do. And this allows us to basically start to segment out not just who got authenticated, because we've proved they're in possession of their device associated with their account, but we can start to take those non-authenticated customers and we can stratify them out and give different risk profiles for them. And the nice thing about this is that this can all be done before a call is even answered. And this is a survey question that just asks about, how important is it that you get that indication when the call is answered. And fraud teams want signals early. That makes sense, right? If you want to know as soon as you are in the user journey, you want to know, I've got a trusted user. You want to know really early on which users are not trustworthy based on how they've made the call into your call center. And that's kind of unique. If you think about most techniques that are going to be used to detect fraud in a call center, it's voice biometrics, I'm listening to all sorts of attributes of this call. We have to engage with the caller to do that, which also means, by the way, you've let that caller start talking to an agent. And the core competency of a fraudster ultimately is their social engineering skills. They're going to get somebody on the phone, they're going to be playing tapes of crying babies in the background and all sorts of crazy stuff, and they're going to get agents that just aren't fully trained and fully disciplined and fully experienced to start to violate their authentication policies. So the sooner that we can warn that agent that this is risky, the sooner we can let a fraud team know that this is a risky call, the better, and that's certainly reflected here. The other thing, of course, that organizations want, they want to do all of that without screwing up the customer experience. So that often is a trade-off, right? There's always this sort of zero-sum game of I've hardened up my authentication standards, I better protect the account, but I've compromised the user experience. And nowhere is that more true, right, than the current status in a call center. I'm using a technique, knowledge-based authentication. It costs me a lot of money in order to have agents asking those questions. Customer experience is terrible. But with a different technology that can really deliver on this pre-answer, invisible, automated processing, what customers can do is start to stratify out those callers. They can take the authenticated callers, which I'm representing here by the sort of dark green color, and deliver a great experience to them. So what we see is that those callers get step-down authentication. Some of them may only last for social or something really easy, and you're off to a great experience. You get more permissions. You may get higher money transfer thresholds because you've come in with the strong authentication token. On the other hand, for maybe 1 or 2% of callers, they're the ones that have triggered all of these risk threads. They're using a virtualized call service. It looks like they're spoofing that call. There's no identity data associated with that phone number. That turns out to be a very good predictor of risk. And so for that type of caller, as soon as you're engaging with them, you can start to step up authentication. You may route that caller to a different set of agents that take on high-risk callers. You may limit some of the permissions that those callers get to do in that calling experience. Maybe they can't do money transfers, for example. So in this way, and I think you can see the parallels for passkeys, right? If you come in and you successfully deliver the passkey for your account, you should be able to get a great experience with step-down authentication and with more permissions of what you can do. And the same kind of applies in the call center. So I'm going to just go to this one. So we talk a lot about, and I've seen several presentations this week, that with passkeys you get a better customer experience, reduced operating costs, and improved security for accounts. And I think all of that gets back to that. We've got a solid base of a device-based authenticator, and that allows those benefits to be realized. We've been operating this service for almost 10 years, so that has given us the chance to work with a lot of customers and to better understand some of the benefits that they get. Overall, we see around a 10 to 20% reduction in call center operating costs, driven by two things. One, more callers will stay in the interactive voice response system or the IVR. How many of you have called into an IVR? You've got to authenticate, you got to provide this, you got to provide that. You just start hitting the 0 button to get to that operator, right? I want to get to that agent. If you can take someone that you already know is highly trusted, you can provide, last four social, really simple to put in, and you're done. Well, guess what? We see about a 10% reduction from IVR to agent transfers by simplifying it. That's just calls to agents that disappeared, and it saves a tremendous amount of money. And then, of course, for those calls that do go through, if we're able to streamline, instead of asking 3 hard questions, you can ask one easy one, well, you've just reduced average handle time. One of my favorites on this is the improvement in customer satisfaction. So a lot of our customers have done various studies. My favorite sort of one, it doesn't fit in the 15%, but it's a really interesting measure of customer satisfaction, is one of our clients did a study looking at what was the factor, of all the factors, that best related or best drove product upsells. So this was a financial services client, and the number one factor was that they were authenticated through this service because they got their problem solved quickly, they weren't frustrated, and just naturally in a better mood to listen to a product pitch. So I think it's important to realize that customer satisfaction isn't always abstract. Ultimately, customer satisfaction does drive back to real revenue. So I want to just close with kind of just 3 recap points. Number one, whether it's in the digital channels or it's in the call center, device-based authentication, ownership factor authentication, all of which we're here to work on, really should be the foundation for your authentication process. It doesn't mean don't use biometrics on top of that, but really build your authentication strategies in all the channels using that sort of device-based approach. And certainly in the call center, look at delivering solutions that can be pre-answer, that can be visible, and it can be friction-free for the caller. And finally, leverage that information you get when you're doing that authentication process so that if they don't pass that process, you can use that information to still stratify between people who still don't look to be very risky and those that potentially are very risky and apply the appropriate level of treatment. So I will pause at this point and happy to take questions.
Any questions? I think we've got time for maybe one before lunch.
Lunch awaits.
Or we could go eat lunch. That was a great presentation. Thanks, Lance.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.